Once upon a time,
in a land far away.
I'm Katrina.
And I'm Geoff.
This is the Fairy Tellers Podcast.
Myth, legend, folklore, fable.
We explore what they say about cultures then and now,
Grab a hot cup of cocoa and a comfy seat,
while we tell you a tale.
Welcome back to the podcast for another, you guessed it, exciting episode. And it is especially exciting, probably even for some of you listening who have looked at the title of this episode.
Yeah.
Because I feel like for the first time in forever, to reference another something based off of not a literary fairy tale rather than I'm going off the rails here.
You okay. Are. Let it go, Geoff.
Brilliant. Perfect joke. I was trying to start over so that we could just have a clean cut, but now we have to keep it.
Yeah.
So that we can have that joke in there. We're doing a very, very well-known story, which it feels like it has been a while.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna lie. I didn't go back and look at our catalog and see how long it actually has been. But
yeah,
you know what? It doesn't matter because how I feel, how long it feels to me is what matters.
Yeah.
And we are doing it now. And it feels good.
I agree with you because I kind of felt like I was using, it was kind of like clickbait when I did the Snow White and Rose Red episode title, because you stick the word Snow White in there and people are like, oh, yeah. I know that. And then it's like, no. I mean, the story is called Snow White and Rose Red, so it's not like I was lying to people.
But it's not that Snow White.
But it's not that Snow White. It's not like what you're thinking it is. Which is fine because we did a whole series on Snow White episodes, which I was going to say, normally when we do those big headliner titles, the ones that people recognize when they see them, usually when we do those, it's after we've done months of lead up to the episode where I'm like, I'm not going to tell you Beauty and the Beast first. Let me do all these other adjacent tales. And for this one, we're kind of going to do it the opposite way.
Nice.
And I have a reason for doing that. And hopefully people will be, as ready to indulge me as they normally are when I'm like, there's a reason why I'm telling you 10 other tales before I launch in on this one thing.
There's a reason why we're not telling you 10 other tales and we're just launching in this time. So Trust us.
Yes.
Trust the process.
And yeah, we get to do Little Red Riding Hood, a story that I have actually been avoiding putting on our roster to do for a while because the majority of the essays and topics and research around it, there has been so much research and academic conversation about this one tale so much. And it all seems to focus around psychoanalytics and psychoanalysis that I don't find I don't find it useful and I don't find it enjoyable. Frankly.
Don't hold back. Go off.
Go off, Queen. Katrina's hot takes where it's Bruno Bettelheim can suck. No.
Who's that?
Bruno Bettelheim, the author of The Uses of Enchantment.
Oh, that we talked about last time.
Mm-hmm. That's okay. You don't bother memorizing this man's name. We're going to talk a lot about him today.
I mean, I was trying not to bother memorizing his name last time, but then it came up again, so jokes on me.
Yeah, you're now you're strengthening those neural pathways, so I'll never forget this man. But anyway, so a lot of the conversation around this story focuses on psychoanalytics. And I am not a huge fan of that. And so I feel like I had a way to approach the story that would be enjoyable for me and then not enjoyable for listeners. Because if I'm crapping on the story and the research while I'm retelling it, I don't feel like that's as fun. Or if I lack enthusiasm when I'm retelling it, I feel like that translates to a bad time for people listening.
I would say yes to the second one. If you're not
if I'm not
if you're not enthusiastic about it, If you're not enjoying it, then I think it's not going to make for a great podcast. However, I do think if you're enjoying like crapping on it and crapping on the research about it, that still could make for an enjoyable, entertaining episode. Not necessarily the type of content that we are trying to put out. We're usually, trying to like celebrate and like lean into the tales and the research and stuff around it. So, maybe a bonus episode. Seems like bonus episode material where you're like, okay, now this is how I really feel about it all.
Yeah.
Not that you're not going to say how you really feel about it now, but you I think have found like a different road that is enjoyable and that you will be interested.
And I also feel like we on the podcast have had enough discussions about all of these like other related things that I finally have enough interesting things to say about this story that we can make an enjoyable episode that it will be like education for everybody. So with that, I'm actually going to be trying in this episode to retell 3 different stories.
Ooh.
And the first one is going to be, I would argue, the most famous version, except for the end. And that is Charles Perrault's version of Little Red Riding Hood. That was also then the version that was used in the Blue Fairy book that was compiled by Andrew and Lenora Lang. So this one is fairly short, and so I'm going to retell it, and I'm going to retell it, I was going to say quick and dirty, but the Freudians might read too much into that. Yes. So, once upon a time, classic. Thank you, Charles. There was a little village girl who was the prettiest girl that anyone had ever seen. Of course. They always have to be pretty. Lovely.
Or else it's not worth telling a story about them.
Mm-hmm.
That's how they felt.
Yep.
I don't feel that way, just to clarify.
Yipes. So her mother doted on her, and her grandmother was even more fond of her and made her a little red hood, and that she became so well known for wearing that red hood that this girl was then called Little Red Riding Hood. So one day, her mother had just made and baked some cakes, and she told her daughter that her grandmother was currently sick in her cabin in the woods and would like some cake and butter, and she needed to be a good little girl and set off to take these things to her grandmother. And so she set off at once from her house to her grandmother, who lived in like the next village over. So she had to go through the woods to get to grandmother's house.
Mm-hmm. Over the river before that.
But I guess her grandmother didn't live in the woods.
Right.
Yeah, you got me. Anyway, so on the way through the woods, I don't think any listener will be shocked to know that she met an old wolf. And in Charles Perrault's version, he is described as old father wolf. So try not to get your Oedipal panties in a twist.
Too late.
I realized as I was saying that when I stuck in
Edible panties,
it sounded like edible panties. And then I just been talking about oral fixation. I was like, you know what? I'm going to leave that in there. A little Freudian slip, if you will.
Yeah. So just lean into it. Lean way into it.
Yeah. We're going to be enjoying it today. So in the story, back to it, it said he would have very much liked to eat her, but dared not do so on account of some woodcutters who were in the forest. So interesting that they mention that there's woodcutters in the forest and that he doesn't want to get caught by a woodcutter in the forest. We'll see what happens. So he asked the little girl where she was going, and she, not knowing that it is dangerous to stop and listen to wolves or talk to wolves, replied to him, "I'm going to see my grandmother, and I'm taking her a cake and a pot of butter, which my mother has sent to her." And the wolf asked her, "Well, how far away does she live?" And Little Red Riding Hood was like, "Oh, I'll tell you exactly where she lives. Her address is..." If you're listening to this, don't tell people where your ailing grandmother lives by herself. Don't do that. If you're a small child, don't be, "My parents aren't at home. I'm all by myself in my house." Don't do that. First rule of Babysitter's Club. I don't know. I was never in a Babysitter's Club.
Me either. I did read the books. Some of them.
Did you say you read the books?
Yeah, I did. Some of them I said.
Geoff, I know that I said this off mic earlier tonight.
Uh-huh.
You would have made a great girl dad. Just gonna say. Anyway, back to it. So after Little Red had told the wolf where she lived, the wolf was like, oh, you know what? I think I shall go and see her too. I'll go by this path and you go by that path, and we will see who gets there first. I'm going to pause here and I won't get too far into it, but there are, you will not be surprised to know, other tales that existed before this version, other French oral tradition tales that existed before this version by Charles Perrault, where the wolf asks the girl if she wants to take the path of pins or the path of needles. What that essentially means is, do you want to take the easy path or the hard path? And she picked the easy path, and he picked the harder path, but it also ends up being shorter. And so she's the one in the story, in those other versions, those other oral versions, she's the one who picks the path first. In this one, the wolf decides the path that she goes down. But also, as we'll see in 3 seconds, she takes too long on the path anyway because she does get distracted. So anyway, the wolf set off running with all his might down the shorter road, and the little girl continued on her way on the longer road. And she also was stopping and amusing herself by gathering nuts, running around with the butterflies, and making nosegays of the wildflowers which she found. So little bundles of like flowers that were called nosegays. I'm pretty positive because they were just for like, they were like little bundles of sniffing flowers, I think.
To make your nose happy.
Yeah.
I get it. I did not know that. I was thinking like nosegays, like stopping to look at the flowers.
Oh,
with
like
nose.
gaze
upon.
Gaze with your nose. Nice.
But that's not how it's spelled, I'm assuming. I'm assuming it's...
Yeah, it's spelled...
Nosegays, like nose happies.
Yes. So she was just chasing butterflies, picking flowers, doing whatever, after she had told this wolf where Grandma lives. So the wolf was not long in reaching the grandmother's house. He knocked on the door. Who's there? It's your little daughter, Red Riding Hood. And people will make a big deal of it that he said that he was her daughter and not her granddaughter. Because in this story, the mother character and the grandmother character do collapse into one another to speak to our dilemma as daughters aging. Or maybe just said daughter because it is also understood that it's like a generational title of I'm a younger person who's related to you.
Yeah. Like in some cultures where, like even today, where like people will call strangers that are like I know in Japan, like old women that are like strangers that you meet on the street, you just call them basically like grandma, kind of.
Yeah.
Like some cultures where people just call like women of their community that are older than they are, like auntie or whatever.
Yes.
Even though they're not related to them at all. You know, just kind of like, I know with like Japanese culture, there's a big emphasis on seniority. Like if someone is 1 year, and it's I know Korea has something similar. Like if someone's 1 year older than you, they're like your superior, and you like acknowledge and respect them as being even just 1 year older than you. And so like I've thought of that as like, oh, that people they're calling them grandmother or whatever. Like,
yeah.
And specifically talking about like womanhood, when we've talked about on the podcast, like mother, maiden, crone.
Yeah.
And it was like identifying you by, it was like we've talked about identifying the like crone age range. Oh, the mother age range. And definitely, I think, at least in the cultures that I've grown up with, I think people, to some degree or another, it's in the culture to like identify someone as like being like a maiden, like, oh, like she's not married. Like we call like her Miss rather than Miss or Mrs. or whatever. Just thought it was interesting.
Yeah. When I'm like waiting, I'm in a shop with my kids waiting for like a drink order or whatever, like at a coffee shop. And they're like, oh, here you go, mama. Totally fine. Because they're like, I know they're not calling me mother. They're not like, It's not some kind of Freudian, psychological thing that they're going through where like they're identifying me as their new mother.
Maybe they are. Maybe they could be.
They're just acknowledging I am a mother, and they don't know what to call me. Madame. Like, no, that'd be like weird.
Especially because we don't speak French.
Yeah. That's the big reason. But anyway, so it is your little daughter. This is where we got off track.
Oh, we're telling a story right
now?
now?
We're in the It's your little daughter, Red Riding Hood, and I brought you some cakes and a little pot of butter as a present. And it says, the worthy grandmother. It's an interesting choice of words. The worthy grandmother was in bed, not being very well, and cried out, pull out the peg and the latch will fall. So the wolf drew out the peg and the door flew open, and he sprang upon the poor old woman, and he ate her up in less than no time. Less than no time. He had eaten her before he was even in the house. That's how time works.
Yeah, he broke the continuity of time. That's how
quickly he was like eating this woman up. But it did say that, he had gone 3 days without food, so he was hungry, so he ate quickly. So after that, he shut the door, laid down in the grandmother's bed, and he waited for Little Red Riding Hood. And pretty soon, there she was, knocking on the door. Actually, do you know what would be funny? Is because she took so long. He's laying in bed for forever, just being like, is she coming? Or did
did I go to the right house? Have I eaten someone else's grandmother by mistake?
That'd be
that would be embarrassing.
Awkward. So she knocked at the door, and he's disguising his voice, was like, who's there? And Little Red Riding Hood heard the voice, and it sounded gruffer. Gruffer? It sounded gruffer than her grandmother normally sounded. But she thought to herself, oh, she must be really sick. Which
sicker than I thought.
Mom was right. She is real messed up. And so she called out, it's your little daughter, Red Riding Hood, and I bring you a cake and a little pot of butter from my mother. And trying to soften his voice a little bit more, the wolf called out to her, pull out the peg and the latch will fall. So Little Red Riding Hood drew out the peg and the door flew open. And when he saw her enter, the wolf hid himself in the bed. He pulled up the covers to hide a little more. And he said, put the cake and the little pot of butter on the bin. I don't think I understand the word for bin. But, he was set that down and come up on the bed with me. So Little Red Riding Hood took off her clothes. And when she climbed into bed, she was astonished to see how grandmother looked in her nightgown. And so she called out, grandmother dear, what big arms you have, the better to embrace you, my child. Grandma dear, what big legs you have, the better to run with, my child. Dear grandmother, what big ears you have, the better to hear you with, my child. Grandmother dear, what big eyes you have, the better to see you with, my child. Grandmother dear, what big teeth you have, the better to eat you with. With these words, the wicked wolf leapt upon Little Red Riding Hood and gobbled her up. The end. So, Charles Perrault, of course, stuck a moral at the end for us.
Of course.
Little girls.
Specifically.
Yes. This seems to say, never stop upon your way. Never trust a stranger friend. No one knows how it will end. As you're pretty, so be wise. Wolves may lurk in every guise. Handsome they may be and kind, gay or charming, never mind. Well, if they're no. I was like, now as then, 'tis simple truth, sweetest tongue has sharpest tooth.
Oh.
So we've talked about in the past doing this podcast when we've been talking about the French salons and Charles Perrault. We talked a little bit about how, what story were we talking about, Geoff? When we were talking about the fairies, it's the one with the diamonds coming out of the mouth or toads coming out of the mouth.
Right.
How Charles Perrault, he was in this big debate in the salons about the ancients versus modern, whether studying the ancients and old wisdom was better for people, or whether there existed a lot of morality tales and good learning that could be found within the folk tales. So not big mythologies, but wisdom to be found in local folklore and the people. And so Charles Perrault was very much on the side of the moderns and wanted to prove that that was the case. And so one of the things that he was working towards doing was taking folk tales and other like fairy stories that were very popular being circulated, and using them in a way that would shape them to create a moral. And it's within this story and his shaping of it, which today, like I said, we're going to do another episode talking about this tale type. But first, we're going to be looking at the tales that have been used the most to analyze this story, and how it's been kind of a mistake not to look at the other tale types that are related to it for information, especially when they're trying to say this story is about this like one thing. But Charles Perrault changed the story that was circulating so that he could make it a morality tale. And he, in his tale, made the story more explicitly about sex than it was before. Because he, in trying to make it about morals, about making it into specifically a story about girls watch out for your bodies because creepy men are lurking everywhere, and you need to then be careful so that it's very victim blamey. We're not going to get terribly into that. But because he was changing the story into not just like a story about like being attacked by an animal, it is very much like Reinhard the fox, but trying to get into, an animated wolf trying to get into bed with you.
Right.
But your thoughts on this tale so far, and things you were surprised it was missing or had in it?
Yes, I was surprised it was missing. Like when you said the end, I thought you were just joking, because I was expecting
someone to get saved.
Yeah, I was expecting the woodcutter to come and chop the ladies out of the wolf's stomach.
Yeah.
Because that's, in my recollection of all of, the Little Red Riding Hood stories that I was familiar with, that's what happens.
But yeah, it's missing the whole end of the story.
Yeah, exactly.
So the end of the story that people often associate with this tale, it actually comes from the Brothers Grimm version of the story. But before we get to the Brothers Grimm version of the story, which Geoff is going to be retelling, I'm going to be telling another Brothers Grimm story. And this is another thing where like it comes into play that we have been talking a lot about while we're doing the like that kind of like college course stuff that we've been talking about and focusing on. The knowledge that we've gained from that, the discussions that we've had there are going to be useful in what we're talking about today. And it shows like why it's important to have like that foundational knowledge and understanding when you're looking at fairy tales and talking about them, discussing them. And Geoff, you're going to like this. The Little Red Riding Hood, the ATU number is 333.
I do love that.
But the story that I'm going to be telling before we get to the Grimm's Brothers Little Red Riding Hood is ATU 123.
No way. This is the best day of my life.
ATU type 123, Wolf and the Kids. So in the Grimm's Brothers collection, it is called The Wolf and the Seven Young Kids. Delicious. Kids, children, cute. No, goats.
Yeah, I was going to say, is it about goats or is it about children? And I figured it must have been goats. And then you were just about to confuse me with your joke.
Yep. And then I unconfused you.
And I appreciate that.
You're welcome. So, once upon a time, love it. There was an
Classic.
old goat. So this old goat had 7 young kids, children. And she loved them as any mother loved her children. So one day she had to go into the forest to get some food because that's where goats go to get their food, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, historically, people too.
Yeah.
Nowadays, we go to the grocery store or whatever. But sorry, continue.
No, you're fine. And so she called all of her children, all 7 of her kids, over to her, and she told them, "Okay, children, I'm going into the forest, and I want you to keep up your guard against the wolf. If he gets in here, he'll eat you all up, skin and bones. That villain often disguises himself, but you can recognize him right away by his gruff voice and black feet. So we're looking for his little paws. Adorable paws. Because goats got freaky feet. These little devil children. Just kidding. I went really hard against goats. They got freaky eyes, too.
They do.
Them and their square...
Eyes are way freakier than their freaks.
I think it's like their eyes and sheep eyes are all really freaky deaky. Anyway, my bad. I'm sorry. They're the protagonists. And I'm like, do you know what's disgusting? Goats. Anyway, so all of the children were like, we'll take care of ourselves. Don't worry about us, Mom. We've got this covered. They did not. So the old goat, she went on her way into the forest, believing that her kids, were going to follow instructions and not let any strangers into the house. So not long time had gone by before there was a knock at the door, and there was a knock at the door and a voice that called up, open up, dear children. I'll do the voices, Jeff.
Ooh, yeah, please do.
Open up, dear children. Your mother's back and has brought something for each one of you. Mama's back. Yipes. Big yikes. And that's what the children said. They said, big yipes. We're not going to open up the door. You're not our mom. She has a lovely, soft voice, and yours is gruff and rough and terrifying, and we hated it. And so the wolf went away and went to a shopkeeper. I love it. I love the idea of this wolf just going over to a shopkeeper and being like, hey, can I have, it says a big piece of chalk in this story. Other stories will say like honey or like a sweet syrup or like something like that to smooth out the voice. But in this story, the shopkeeper gave him some chalk to eat and it softened his voice. So he returned back, knocked on the door, and was like, open up, dear children. Your mother's back and has brought something for each one of you. But the wolf then put his big black paw on the windowsill, and the children saw it and were like, ew, fur. Our mom doesn't have. And so the kids called out, we're not opening our door. Our mother doesn't have black paws like yours. You're the wolf. So the wolf ran to a baker and asked to put some dough on his foot. What's funny is he said that he had stubbed his toe and needed the dough on his foot to soothe his foot, which I'm like, is that a folk remedy for stubbed toes? I've never put dough on a stubbed toe, and I've recently had a stubbed toe. So
has whatever you've been doing worked?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh. Well, there you go. If it doesn't sometime, give it a try. Put some dough on there.
Put some dough on there. No, I put some antibiotic ointment on it and then bandages.
Huh.
Did the baker not have didn't have antifungal, antibacterial ointments to put? Anyway, so the baker covered the wolf's paw in dough, and then he ran over to the miller and said, sprinkle some white powder on my paw. And it said,
that'll make you feel better.
Yep. The miller thought, the wolf wants to trick someone. So he at first refused because he was like, nah, you're up to something, man. But the wolf said, if you don't do it, I'll eat you up. It's pretty persuasive. So the frightened miller, he sprinkled white flour onto the wolf's dough paw. Will that make it look more like a goat hoof, though? I guess. But I love it said, in regards to like the miller after he got threatened, this frightened the miller, so he made the wolf's paw white. Yes, indeed. That's the way people are. You threaten their life and they're more likely to do what you say? Yeah, I guess so. So the wolf went back to the house a third time and knocked and said, open up, children. I'll do the sweet voice. Open up, children. Your dear mother's back and has brought something from the forest for each of you. And the kids called out, first, show us your paws so we know that you're really our dear mother. And so he put his paw on the windowsill. When they saw it was white, they were like, oh, good. That's definitely our mother's hand, which I judged them. Anyway, they opened the door, and who else but the wolf stepped inside. So the kids were terrified and tried to hide themselves. And so like it says like in the story, all the places that the children tried to hide, when it's like jumped under the table, into the bed, into the oven. Not smart. The kitchen cabinets, cupboards, wash basin, clock case. But the wolf began to find them one by one. So he was just, walking around the house playing hide and go seek snack time. My favorite game as a babysitter. hide and go seek snack time. Anyway, so the wolf was just walking around eating them one by one. And so he swallowed them. He said swallowed one after the other down his throat, but he was unable to find the youngest, smallest little goat child who had hidden themselves in the clock case. So also, the wolf hadn't done good counting when he came in the room to see how many there were, or,
That's on him.
when he was eating them. So six is so similar to 7 when you're completely full. I know that when I'm having a big bowl of dumplings, if somebody asked how many did you eat, I don't know. I wasn't counting.
Yeah, and it's one of those things I was hearing about numbers. Like, we have a really good idea as human beings of like how many, like up to about like 5. Like, once there are more than 5, like you can look at a grouping of something and be like, oh, there's about 5 of those things there. And sometimes 6, which makes sense too, because of like, you look at like the pips on a die.
Yeah.
There's like, and there's like no dice that really use pips beyond 6 pips, because you're like, I can't tell how many there are. And I feel like even with 6, like we only know there's 6 because we know like the pattern of like 3 and 3.
Yeah.
So it's like, we're really not even seeing 6. We're just like 3 and 3 and then times 6. But it really is one of those, I don't know. Well, I don't know if it really is. It's one of those things that I have heard about how basically you're like, oh, 1, 2, 3, 4. And after that, your brain is just like a lot.
Yeah.
So, he went and he saw a lot of goats.
Yeah.
And then he ate a lot of goats. He's like, you know what? I ate a lot of goats. There were a lot of goats here.
It was probably all of them.
Yeah.
Who's to say it wasn't? No one.
No one.
And so when the wolf was full and thought that, he'd finished his charcuterie board of children, he tottered off and laid down beneath a tree on a green meadow, and he fell asleep. Love a good nap after a good meal. So shortly after, the old goat came home from the forest, and oh no, the sight that met her eyes when she got home, and the door was wide open and everything was all a mess, and benches overturned, things just lying in pieces, pillows and blankets ripped to shreds. So she looked for her kids and they were nowhere to be found until she heard a small voice calling from the clock case, "Dear mother, I'm here." Oh, little guy. So she pulled him out and he told her that the wolf had come and that they'd let him in the house and they'd all gotten eaten. And so obviously she was upset and she cried and cried and cried for her dear children. But eventually she went outside with the youngest kid running right beside her. And when they reached the meadow, she found the wolf snoring so loudly that the tree branches above him were trembling. So it says she examined him from all sides and saw that something was moving and wriggling in his stuffed stomach. And she was like, oh no, oh yes. He swallowed my children alive. Because like, oh, if somebody's still moving in there, then there's a chance. Maybe I can get some of my kids back. That's how I felt when I was pregnant and seeing like a kid like moving around in there. I was like, that's insane.
Yeah, that is.
There's like a living thing inside of me.
I mean, I didn't even have it inside of me, but to see that in another person is crazy.
Yeah. So, and here's where things get a little gory, Jeffrey. This old goat sent her little kid home to fetch scissors, needle, and thread. And then she cut the wolf's belly open. And he did not wake up during this, which, wow, what is this?
Yeah,
real life or a fairy tale? They're really testing my limits of believability on this story. But anyway, so she sliced the wolf's belly open, and immediately upon the first cut, a, goat head popped out, terrifying. And so she cut all 6 of the kids out, popping out one after the other, and they were all still alive and had not suffered the least bit of harm, thanks to the wolf swallowing them all whole quickly. So they hugged their dear mother. It said hopped about like a tailor at his own wedding.
Okay.
Maybe because he's happy because he dressed everybody so nicely and he's getting married. I don't know. So the old goat said, "Now go, children, and look for stones in the field, and we'll fill the godless beast's belly with them while he's asleep." So the kids ran off and quickly grabbed large stones and brought them over to their mother, as many as they could fit into his stomach. And so the goat sewed him up again with such speed that he didn't notice a thing. And when he awoke, feeling, finally content after his long nap, which I guess once his stomach wasn't digesting anything anymore, I wake you up pretty quickly because if you fell asleep because you were so satisfied with all you ate, but then it all ran out of your stomach, I don't know.
Probably be hungry.
I'm like, Katrina, don't try to make sense of this right now. But the stones in his stomach had made him really thirsty, and probably a bunch of blood loss as well made him. Sorry. So he decided to go to the well and have a drink. But as he began to walk, he was like swaying back and forth, and the stones were knocking against each other and rattling. And he called out, "What's that in my belly rumbling? Could it be my bones are crumbling? 6 little kids I thought I ate. They're more like stones with all their weight." I love a good rhyme stuck in there by the Grimm's brothers. So when he reached the well and leaned over to drink the water, the heavy stones caused him to kind of like topple over and pulled him down into the well, and he drowned in a miserable way. I don't think there's a way to not drown in a miserable way. I thought you were about to argue with me that you're like, no, there's
no. I was about to agree with you. I think drowning probably is not a very fun way to go.
And so after this, after the goats saw this, they ran about jumping up and down, saying, "The wolf is dead, the wolf is dead." And they took their mother and danced for joy around the well. The end. That is so lovely. So, any immediate thoughts, ideas on this story?
I mean, I can tell why we're telling it now, because it had that element that I was expecting that was missing from the other story about cutting the stomach open to free the people that had been eaten.
Yeah.
That's what I normally remember happening with Little Red Riding Hood and her granny.
Yeah, that does seem to be related. You had like a maternal figure who is like warning kids to like watch out, be careful, look out for like danger that lurks around. You have a character who's disguising themselves. I mean, it's a wolf in this story, but you have a character disguising themselves as a maternal figure, all for the sake of getting these little like innocent children into their stomach.
Yeah. And there's something about it being like everyone being animals that makes it like kind of make more sense. Like I always thought it was a little weird with Little Red Riding Hood. And I'm like, now I'm struggling to think, because obviously it's not unique in like having animals and humans like interacting, but I feel like the wolf is behaving especially human-like in a story that has actual humans in it as well.
Yeah.
It's like we expect, animals to all be behaving human-like when we're like personifying them all and they're all just animals. But it's kind of like there's something almost, I mean, I guess because except for the fact there's not other animals, but like Goofy and then, and Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse and Donald Duck. And then Pluto is a dog, but like so is Goofy. But why is Pluto like a dog, but Goofy's like a human dog? You know what I mean?
I thought what you were going to say was like if there was all of that and then there was just a man like standing in the middle of things, and just like named Terry.
Right.
Just like just some guy.
Although I guess, wait, I'm confused. Maybe. Who was it that was cutting them out of the...
The mom. The mom.
The mom did. Okay, yeah. Because we talked... Was it the other story? You said there were woodcutters in the area?
Uh-huh, yeah.
Okay, that was the other story. Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and in Charles Perrault's version, the reason why the wolf... So they gave a reason why the wolf didn't want to eat her on the trail.
Right, but then woodcutters never show up again.
Yeah.
Just an excuse to not eat her then and there.
Yeah, because like that was one thing that like for me, I was always not understanding why the wolf didn't eat the girl while she was already in the woods by herself. Like she was like on her own. And then I've always heard people like explain it. Oh, he wanted to eat the grandma and the little girl. And so he wanted to know where the grandmother was so that he could go and eat the grandmother first and then have the other snacks show up. So I liked that in this story, they like, or in the Charles Perrault version, they like had that one sentence of explanation of there were woodcutters in the area. And so he didn't want to eat her on the trail. And so it was like, okay, interesting. So Charles Perrault's version of Little Red Riding Hood, we know came out in the late 1600s. It was like 1697, somewhere around there. And then over 100 years later, we have the Grimm's brothers in 1812 publishing their book.
Wait a minute. Did you say 100 years later?
Yeah, over 100 years, because it's from 1697.
That's crazy.
To 1812.
Wow, that's wild. I don't. I'm sure those dates have like been mentioned before on the podcast, and I just have not paid close enough attention, or like
it's been
thought of it.
Yeah, I really think it's been a while since we've like actually talked about like that timeline.
Yeah, because I mean, I do know like early 1800s, like early 19th century, Brothers Grimm, that was a thing. And so I was like, oh, Charles Perrault could have been earlier. I feel like I have the sense that it was, but I feel like in my mind, it's like, okay, Grimm's were like 1812, like 1790, 1780, but it's like, no, 16 something. Because I also am thinking, and maybe you can, I know you probably do know, I know you know, but in the 19th century, so 1800s, like a lot of people, a lot of places were doing the folklore collecting thing, and it's a like kind of like nationalism and all sorts of stuff being wrapped up into that as well.
Yeah,
that I remember from my world history classes back in high school. So it seems like a lot more people were doing than Charles Perrault back in apparently the 1600s. I feel like, man, I know we must have said that before, but it's never like really hit me in my mind.
Yeah,
how much earlier than the Brothers Grimm's that was.
Because what was going on, like if you think about, I was about to say like if everybody can think about like the Napoleonic Wars and like when those were going on, but as we all do sometimes, pause and think about, just remember when the Napoleonic Wars were happening. But it was around the time of the Brothers Grimm.
Yeah.
And which was why there was that like pull of like nationalism. There was a lot of unrest in Europe at the time, and people trying to, in several different places, they were either like post-revolution or very, very close to pre-revolution. And so there was like a lot of like, who are we as the people? And what do we stand to gain or lose by our own identity of the place that we're at? And like a lot of those questions.
Yeah.
And so I can see why it does feel like, oh, Charles Perrault's happening like around the same time, possibly because he's also compiling, if like, it feels like stories like of the folk. But he was very much writing stories for the salons of aristocratic France.
Because also now, like
pre-revolution,
right? Of course.
Yeah.
Hopefully, this will be the end of this sidebar. But then put it in mind, because also I have the feeling of Jean-Baptiste Basile being early as well,
by like a lot more.
Yeah, because I feel like there's a lot. One of those things where it's like when people are like the original, which we have feelings about that, but lots of times they will go back to like Jean-Baptiste Basile. Like when there are ones that have been in Charles Perrault, that have been in Brothers Grimm, or tale types that have, it's like the one that appears and is recorded earliest seems to me to be Italian, Jean-Baptiste Basile.
Yeah, or I'm going to mispronounce his name, Straparola.
Yeah, Straparola.
I'm like, it's like whoop, and a leap back even then. But yeah, Jean-Baptiste Basile, he was alive from 1566 to 1632.
Oh my goodness.
And so
wow,
he was,
after 130 episodes, the timeline of these famous folklores is finally solidifying in my brain.
No, it's fine, because we don't talk about this like every single episode. It's not like we're like, all right, let's lay out the timeline. Because usually during an episode, I do try to like say whatever kind of relevant dates for the stories we're discussing.
Yeah, and it's like the particular one. It's just one of those instances where we're talking about multiple from these different people rather than just like more contemporary ones to each other.
And so
anyway,
that's why like when it comes up of like importance, it's like, okay, who was saying what when?
Yeah.
And it is important to note, like especially with Little Red Riding Hood, when we talk about other stories in a later episode, that at least when we have the things written down, even as imperfect as it is, that they change elements in them or shift them, we at least have the dates down of when those stories were already circulating.
Right.
And so it's like, even if Charles Perrault took liberties with the story and changed elements to make it into like a morality tale, we at least know that the story was popular and like circulating as an oral tradition tale in 1697.
Right.
But also we have to keep in mind that the Brothers Grimm really liked Charles Perrault. We've talked about that recently, like in episodes, that they really liked him and how he did it. And they were not impressed by like the Solanaires, like the women who were writing like the Slan tales, because they thought that they sounded too artsy-fartsy, too literary, too aristocratic, and not of the folk. They're like, no, this doesn't capture like the folk, not like Charles Perrault.
Ironic.
Yeah. Now we have the Brothers Grimm version of Little Red Cap
that I will be retelling. Something funny about this is, so I read this to my son, who, if you recall, listeners, I know you do, Katrina, has like this goal. He wants to read the entire Brothers Grimm fairy tale collection. And when I was reading this one to him, you had sent me like pictures of it from whatever book. So it was like clearly not from our Brothers Grimm book.
Yeah.
But he did know that, because I think we may have read it. I'm not sure. But he did know that that the Brothers Grimm have a version of Little Red Riding Hood. But he was convinced that this version was not the Brothers Grimm version. And he had some reasons I can't remember too. I think he was like, well, one of them is like common misconception among many people of like, oh, like the Brothers Grimm version would have been even like more violent and darker and like crazier, like is what he thought. And I was like, were you listening? This was pretty violent and gruesome and crazy.
Yeah. But I'm like, it is funny when you've heard a version of something, but then somebody tells you, oh, but there's something like even worse, even like freakier. And so you start to imagine what that super, super freaky thing like is. And sometimes our imagination is more terrifying than like what the thing was. Or like we think it has to be freakier than anything I could think of.
Right.
And then when it's not, might still be like, oh, it's still pretty violent. It's like, well, not as violent as I wanted it to be.
So this is Little Red Cap and I also, when we were having this discussion with my son, did not know that this was the Brothers Grimm version, because it doesn't say on any of the pages that I had that it was Brothers Grimm either. So I was like, oh, maybe it's not. I don't know.
But no, it came from the complete fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm, translated and with an introduction by Jack Zipes.
Oh, Jack Zipes. Love it. That also, I think more than anything, it's the translation of it, because it did seem very modern. The language seemed more modern than what like the book than what I'm used to reading. The Brothers Grimm, because the one that we read from, the one thing that like really sticks out to me is it's always like blah 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 says he, blah 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 says she, like stuff like that, which is weird. That's a weird way to say stuff in 2026.
Yeah, it is.
All right, Little Red Cap. Once upon a time, there was a sweet little maiden, period. So we know maiden, not mother, nor crone. And she was so sweet. It doesn't say that she was super beautiful, but it does say that whoever laid eyes upon her could not help but to love her. So she was adorable, if not beautiful.
Yeah. Which I am like, that, yes, that does place her as like a young child. And
even though it probably does mean physical beauty, like adorable typically does mean that in modern English, but if you just really think about it, the word adorable just means able of being adored. You don't have to be like physically good looking to be adored. You know what I mean?
Oh, I love that.
You just have to be a sweetie pants. Anyway, even though anyone that looked upon this little child would love her, her grandmother was the one that loved her the most, and she could never give this child enough. Never spoil her enough. And one time, this grandmother made this little girl a present that was a small red velvet cap. And because it was such a good looking cap, so well made, and this little maiden loved it so much, she insisted on always wearing it, which that is such a little kid thing to do.
It is. A cousin of mine, she had made my daughter this like pink knitted hat. My cousin was on a crocheting kick. My daughter was just currently in her home being babysat at the time that she was like just crocheting hat after hat. So she made her one because her head was near my cousin at the time. And so then my cousin
Yeah.
just popped a hat on her head before she left the house. And that became like the hat that my daughter is wearing in every single picture for like the next 3 years. Now she wears that and a hat that her great grandmother bought her that says Dog Mom on it.
That's why we call her Little Dog Mom. I never knew. I just thought that was a fun nickname.
Yep, I just shout Little Dog Mom at her.
And just like Katrina's daughter, Little Dog Mom, this little girl was known by her signature headwear, which was little red cap. So one day, her mother said to her, so we've identified all 3 stages of womanhood now: maiden, crone, and now mother.
Geoff, I deeply appreciate you leaning into the fact that we do see these like 3 stages of womanhood in it.
I'm hoping it's setting something up for continued conversation,
Geoff,
after this.
I want to tell you right now, I wish it was.
Oh, really? It's not?
Not for the conversation that we're going to
have
today.
Now I feel silly because honestly, that's the reason I've been doing it so much. Well, 1, because I noticed it and it was interesting. And then 2, I was like, oh, they've got to go.
No, because like what is fascinating to me, and I'll just say that these are, a lot of the times, these are stories written by men.
Right.
And
they don't give a flip about the stages of womanhood
for their particular purpose. But then a lot of the analysis that was being done, like talking about like the psychology, like of the stories, like within the stories, was also being done by men. And so what you are pointing out doesn't come until we talk about feminist theory.
So we got to get to like the 60s and 70s.
So I'm like, which
we're going to be in the like 20s and 30s and 40s today.
No, I'm like, it is good that you are mentioning it and that you're kind of like setting up like those ideas there, because that is something that the curriculum starts covering, is like when people then start like looking at these stories through a feminist lens.
Right. So it will be on a test, but not this test. So don't worry about memorizing it for this test, students. Okay.
Correct.
All right. So one day, her mother, once again, we've been telling the story for like 20 minutes and now just barely entering the second paragraph.
So sorry, friends.
As is our way. No, I don't apologize.
I'm like, what's good about these stories for the interrupting and stuff too, is I think that the majority of our listeners are going to be familiar with the story. And so it's not going to confuse them. We're not going to lose anybody.
Yeah, hopefully. If you're lost, send us an email.
And we'll clip out all of our talking in between and just send you just the story. Yeah.
All right. One day her mother said to her, "Come, little Redcap, take this piece of cake and bottle of wine and bring them to your grandmother." Different than cake and butter or whatever.
Yeah. But listen, cake and wine.
Yeah.
Getting a little sacramental.
Didn't even think about that. I just was thinking of the fact that the mom's like, she's sick and she's feeling weak and this will strengthen her. Speaking of the cake. And then if it doesn't, then at least she'll be too drunk to care with the whole bottle of wine. Also, I don't know. It's not an important detail, but it's like she was like making sure mother said too, gave her the advice, like get an early start because it's going to get hot. And one piece of advice. And when you're out in the woods, like make sure you stay on the path. Don't go away from the path, because if you do, what's the reason? You'll fall and you could break the glass bottle and your grandma's not going to get any of her wine. Not that you could get lost. Not that an animal could come across that might want to eat you. It's like Granny won't get her wine if you slip and fall and break the glass bottle. Yeah. So make sure you stay on the path. Yeah. Also, I thought it was really interesting, and I was like waiting for it to pay off, but it never did. Where she says, well, it kind of does, I guess. But when you enter your grandma's room, 1, don't forget to say good morning, because politeness. And then 2, don't go peeping in all of the corners. It's like, just go in, say good morning. Don't go looking all around grandma's room. Just go in and just talk to grandma. Don't look too closely at anything. Yeah. Don't want to see if there's any signs that a wolf could have broken in. It was like, did the wolf impersonate the mom from the start and give this girl some bad advice?
No, I'm just thinking about kids who, like, when they go into like an old person's house and an old person has like nice stuff in their house, and then kids are like, oh, let me just touch. I just want to look. It's like we look with our eyes, not our hands. We look with our eyes on our hands, and kids be grabbing trinkets and like valuable little bobbins and then drop them on the floor. And that's why we can't have nice things.
That's why we didn't have a single glass made of glass
Yeah.
in my house until like I was 32 years old.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about my parents' house.
Yeah. I still use plastic cups.
All right. So Little Red Cap was like, yes, Mom, I'll do exactly what you say. And in this case, the grandmother lived in the forest about a half an hour from the village. And as soon as Little Red Cap entered the forest, as soon as she encountered the wolf. But she was young, she was naive, she didn't know what a wicked sort of creature the wolf was. So she very politely, well, he greeted her by saying, oh, good day, Little Red Cap. And then she very politely greeted the wolf back, good day to you, kind sir, you wolf, my friend. I said that's so weird, but she said, thank you kindly, wolf, is what is written here. And the wolf is asking her by her name, or maybe he wasn't going by her name. Maybe he was just calling her by the piece of distinctive clothing that she was wearing, which also just happened to be what everybody called her. He asks, oh, where are you going so early? And she says, oh, well, I'm going to my grandmother's house. And he's like, what's that you're carrying under your apron? And so Little Red Cap says, oh, this is cake and wine. My grandmother's sick. She's not feeling well. We bake this, giving way more information than is necessary and safe. We bake this bread so that she can get better. So far, it's not more than is safe.
Yeah.
Necessarily. She didn't say that her grandma lives alone. She's just like, oh, she's sick. I'm taking this to make her feel better. That is too much information. Fine, but not, dangerously so. If that makes sense. Not a safety concern. Just edging on a social faux pas, potentially. But he did ask. So now this is where it gets a little unsafe. Because he asked, where does your grandmother live, Little Red Cap? And so she's like, oh, yeah, she lives another quarter of an hour from here. Her house is the one that's under the big oak trees. You can tell which one it is because of all the hazel bushes in front of it. Now that crosses the line into unsafe, Little Red Cap.
Yeah, don't be talking about hazel bushes.
No. And so the wolf at this point, being given too much information, thinks to himself, my, this tender young thing is a juicy morsel. Yipes. She'll taste even better than the old woman. And he's, thinking like, but in order to get both of them, greedy wolf that he is, you'll have to be really clever, really crafty. You have to come up with some slick scheme in order to eat them both. And so he went along his way, walking next to Little Red Cap for a while. And then he's like, hey, wow, hey, look at this. Look, oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. There's so many beautiful flowers around. Oh man, why don't you take a look around? You haven't even noticed. Look at the birds. They're singing so beautifully. You're going like just marching off as if you're going to be late to school. But you need to stop and smell the roses, so to speak, and enjoy life around you. And so Little Red Cap, her attention being drawn, looks around. She sees the beautiful way that the rays of light from the sun are shining through the trees. One of my favorite things about being in the woods, personally, myself. She starts going back around, looking at all the flowers like, oh yeah, they are beautiful. You know what I can do to help my grandma feel better? In addition to the cake, in addition to the wine, I can get her some of these beautiful, fresh flowers. She would love that. And it's still early because I left so early because my mom insisted. I'll still make it to my grandma's house on time. So I have time to be a little more, leisurely about this. Get Granny some flowers. And so Little Red Cap ran off the path and went into the woods looking for flowers. And after she plucked one, she thought she saw another one that was even prettier, a little further off. So she went and she got that one. And then just as she plucks that one, she looks further down, deeper into the woods, and she sees some more beautiful flowers. She's thinking, oh, these one might be even better. So she, after a little while, gets like way deep into the woods. So takes some time to get to her grandma's house. Meanwhile, the wolf goes straight to grandmother's house and knocks on the door. And Granny's voice comes out, oh, who's there? And the wolf pretends to be Little Red Cap. Little Red Cap, I've brought you some cake and wine. Open up. And the grandma's like, oh, just lift the latch. I'm too weak. I can't get up. Which I thought was interesting. I didn't know until I heard you rereading yours about how that like the pin and the latch and the whatever like is a thing that is specifically mentioned in like all of these stories. Yeah. Which to me, it seems like an unnecessary detail. Like, why does she have to? I mean, and not everything is like has to be necessary either in a story, but it's just interesting that it is specifically mentioned, the whole latching of the door thing. Yeah. And maybe it's just to explain like why it's open, why it's unlocked, like why Granny was not.
Yeah, because I'm like, maybe I too like don't know enough about like how doors were secured back in the day. Because I know like when I've read books about like things that are, kind of the same time period as like Little House on the Prairie. When they're talking about like building a door that then can lock from the inside, but not with a key and lock. It's like you had to use like rope latches and like stuff like that, so that to make sure that you could unlock your own door from the outside. And so maybe it was the knowledge of like, oh, this is how you open my door, because you wouldn't know.
Because it's not like standardized like nowadays. Like, oh, you turn the knob. That is the same knob like that everybody has.
And if it's not opening, it's because the door is locked.
Right. Anyway, so the wolf lifted the latch, springs the door open, goes straight to grandmother's bed without saying a word, and gobbled her right up. Next, he put on her clothes, her nightcap, and he lay down in her bed and drew the curtains closed. Meanwhile, Little Redcap had been running around the woods and looking for flowers, and only when she had as many as she could possibly carry did she even remember that she was supposed to be on her way to her grandmother's house. So,
cute little girl. Oh, I was supposed to be going to my grandma's house.
Relatable. When she gets to grandma's house, she's a little confused as to why her grandma's door is wide open. And she enters the room and has that strange feeling that something is not right. And as a matter of fact, even though she usually loved to be at her grandmother's house, she felt really uneasy. And it was like, something's weird going on here. And so she calls out, "Good morning," as her mother had instructed. But I'm also like, oh, maybe this is where it's important. She didn't go around looking around to see why it might be feeling suspicious and off, because her mom told her, don't go peeking around all those corners like a little girl breaking stuff. But when little Redcap called out "Good morning," she didn't get an answer. And so she goes straight to the bed, drew back the curtains of the bed, and there, laying in the bed, was her grandmother, or so she thought, with the cap pulled down over her face, which made her look very strange. And so she said, "Oh, grandmother, what big ears you have." And her quote-unquote grandmother replied, "The better to hear you with." "Oh, grandmother, what big hands you have." "The better to grab you with." That's a little suspicious. But it's interesting too, because I remember like when in the story that I was hearing in my mind, it's like, what big ears you have, what big eyes you have,
what big nose you have, what big teeth.
But the cap was pulled over the granny's face, so you couldn't see her eyes or her nose to comment on them. But you could see the ears and the hands. And it makes a lot more sense why she would maybe potentially be tricked that it's not her granny when she can't see a wolf's face staring straight at her. Just granny's hairy old hands sticking out as usual.
Yep, as usual. Or maybe she covered them with dough and flour so they look like normal hands.
That must be it. But then also next, "Oh, grandmother, what a terribly big mouth you have." So she could see the wolfy snout and should have known better. And to this, the quote-unquote grandmother responded, "The better to eat you with." And no sooner did the wolf say that than he jumped out of bed and gobbled up poor Little Redcap. And then the wolf, satisfied, having eaten 2 whole human beings,
settled down for a long winter's nap.
Yeah, start to get really tired and settle down to sleep, and began to snore very loudly. Not the end, because a huntsman happened to be walking by the house and thought to himself, "Man, the way that old lady's snoring, I better go see if something's wrong with her."
That woman needs a CPAP machine.
Sounds like she's got, sleep apnea. We got to get her CPAP machine plugged in so she can take a good restful nap. And so the huntsman walks into the room, and when he comes to the bed, he saw the wolf lying in it. And so the huntsman says, "I found you at last, you old sitter. I've been looking for you a long time." And with that, he takes his gun and aims it right at the wolf. But then he's like, you know what? This wolf could have eaten the grandmother that lives in this house. And if he's eaten her whole, like I suspect he's done, because that's totally how wolves eat people in one big bite, she could still be saved. So instead of shooting the wolf with his gun, he takes out a pair of scissors and starts cutting open the sleeping wolf's belly, which, again, interesting. I was so interested when you were reading your stories. He made a couple of cuts, and after he made a couple of cuts, he saw a little red cap shining out from inside the belly. So he made a few more cuts, and then Little Redcap jumped out, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, I was so scared. It was so dark inside of there." And then soon after that, the grandmother came out, and she was also alive, but like barely breathing. And Little Redcap went out and quickly fetched some big stones, and they put the stones in the wolf's belly. The wolf, who was still sleeping after having open stomach surgery performed on him and 2 large human beings pulled out of it. But it wasn't until after they'd still filled his belly with stones that he then woke up. And then tried to run away because he saw there was a huntsman there with a gun and some scissors that he'd already used to cut his belly open. But because of the stones in his stomach, he was too heavy and he fell down at once and died. And it's funny that that sentence makes it seem like, oh, the stones were heavy and he fell down and then died from the fall. My guess is he died from blood loss from having been cut open with scissors. But that's just me. But he couldn't run for medical aid because of all the stones weighing down his belly. And seeing this wolf fall down dead, all three, Little Red Cap, her grandmother, and the huntsman were delighted. And so the huntsman skins the fur from the wolf and took it home with him. The grandmother ate the cake and drank the wine that Little Red brought. And, predictably, feeling a little buzz from the wine, with her belly full of cake, started to feel a little better, regaining her health. And Little Red Cap thought to herself that never again is she going to stray from the path and go into the forest, especially when her mother has specifically forbidden it. The end. But also, it says here that there's another story that Little Red Cap, after this whole situation has returned, or this whole situation has occurred, returned to her grandmother's house one day to bring some more baked goods. And another wolf spoke to her and tried to entice her to leave the path. But this time, Little Red Cap, having the experience from before, was on her guard. So she went straight to her grandmother and told her grandmother that she'd seen the wolf. And she said to the grandmother too, she's like, I don't trust this wolf. Like, I think that he would have eaten me right up just like that other wolf would have done, or just like that other wolf had done. And so grandma was like, okay, we're going to get inside here. We're going to lock the door so that the wolf can't get in. And so soon after that, the wolf comes and starts knocking at the door saying, grandmother, it's Little Red Cap, open up, I brought you some baked goods. But Granny knew better because Little Red Cap was already inside the house. And so Little Red Cap and her grandmother stayed quiet, didn't open the door, and Greyhead, they say, who was the wolf's name, circled the house several times until finally he got the idea to jump on the roof, intending to wait on the roof until Little Red Cap came out of the house, thinking that he was no longer there so he could pounce on her and eat her. But they knew that he was up there. And so the grandmother kind of realized what the wolf's plan was and was like, hey, you know what? I've got this like big stone trough in my front yard. Here's what you do, Little Red Cap. Take this bucket and, I just cooked some delicious sausages yesterday. So they've still got that sausage water in the pot on the stove. So why don't you go and take this sausage water and pour it into the trough? And so Little Red Cap did several times, going out there until she filled the big trough full of this delicious sausage water. And when the smell of sausages reached the nose of the wolf, he sniffed around, looked down, realized that the trough was full of something delicious, and stretched his neck out so far that he lost his balance on the roof, fell right into the trough, and drowned. And Little Red Cap went merrily on her way home, and no one harmed her that day either. The end.
Drowning in sausage water.
Which I'm glad they had that secondary little story in there because it's delightful.
And I'm like, and also if you want to get to dive into like the Freud of it all, drowning in sausage water. What a metaphor. What a euphemism. So, first of all, I wanted to say one of my like main impetuses for like wanting to do this tale now, especially after we just recently talked about the psychoanalytic approach to looking at fairy tales and that contribution to like the field of fairy tale studies and how we're affected by the things that have come before, the readings that have like happened before, the writings that have happened before. I was like, okay, this is a good one for us to look at instead of kind of like the way that, we first went over it and talked about it really like quickly, did a cursory, like, okay, this is kind of the stuff that we're talking about. And, we had a good laugh with the uses of enchantment by Bruno Bettelheim and laughing about when her shoes, vaginas, and when her feet, penises, and, had a little laugh. But in Little Red Riding Hood, a Casebook, edited by Alan Dundes. He has like several different essays throughout time. He wanted to compile a book where folklorists who might be looking at like this story in particular might want to see several different essays throughout time and several different kind of like thoughts on the subject. This book was written in 1989, or it was compiled and published in 1980. But he compiled these things, and when I was reading his essay at the back interpreting Little Red Riding Hood psychoanalytically. There's this one quote of his at the beginning. It said, "There are dozens and dozens of psychoanalytic readings of fairy tales, most of which are totally ignored by literal-minded folklorists, frightened and evidently greatly threatened by any thought that fairy tales might have symbolic import. Nearly every psychoanalytic reading of fairy tales uses the Grimm version as the sole point of interpretive departure. A few folklorists have bothered to read Bruno Bettelheim's The Uses of Enchantment, but not many have read earlier psychoanalytic treatments of fairy tales by Geza, Rohim, and others. Rohim was actually trained as a folklorist and was much more conversant with comparative folkloristics than Bettelheim." And I was like, you know what, Alan Dundes? Called out. I've been called out specifically. He almost wrote my name in there. Or he would have if I hadn't been like an infant when he wrote it.
Right.
But I was like, you know what? Yeah, like when it comes to like the psychoanalytic approach and reading things of that vein, no. Bruno Bettelheim, I've read that and then gone, yipes. I'm not saying that now that I've read other stuff, I'm not saying yipes. But it is true that it's like, you know, if you want to understand more or be in conversation with like that approach, you don't just read like one person's interpretation of something and then go, nope, and therefore any psychoanalytic look at this is wrong, because there are other people who also have looked at it from a different lens and disagreed, but had a different take on it. I'm not saying that any of it stuck with me per se, but one thing that I did find super, super interesting, and that Alan Dundes points out in this book, Little Red Riding Hood, a Casebook, is that when some of the earlier works analyzing fairy tales was done, there was so much focus that was put on the Grimms, as if that was the starting point. And the reason why it kind of was the starting point was because a lot of the psychology and psychoanalytics and looking at all this stuff was coming out of Germany. And so you had a lot of these like big thinkers on the subject and this like school of psychoanalytics coming out of Germany. And so they were looking at the stories that they had, the folk tales that they had readily available that, you know, didn't need to be translated out of another language into theirs for them to then analyze like another. It was like the easiest thing to analyze, or the most at hand, the most readily available were German folk tales. And in fact, the story of Little Red Riding Hood, the first person to look at the tale of Little Red Riding Hood from a psychoanalytic approach was Freud. And I thought that was super interesting because one of the reasons why I had kind of been avoiding retelling, I blanked on even this story is called, Little Red Riding Hood, was because I felt like the only stuff that I had heard about it, or like papers that I'd read about it, were the psychoanalytic approach. And I was like, it's not going to be like very interesting. And it was kind of like funny to realize by like, you know, reading Alan Dundes like saying, yeah, the first person who analyzed this psychoanalytically was like Freud himself. It was like, this was like a story that it got started with. So I have a quote from him. "The psychoanalytic study of the Little Red Riding Hood began with Freud, not just because he was the founder of psychoanalysis, but also because he specifically commented on the tale. In a paper on the sexual theories of children published in 1908, Freud described the so-called cloacal theory of creation. Children ignorant of the birth process might logically assume that babies who grow in the body of the mother must exit the body in the same way that all objects located in the general area of the stomach leave the body, namely via the anus."
What?
It's Freud said that children will often be confused about like where babies exit.
Oh, like how babies come from. Like babies come out through the anus. Gotcha. I thought
you were scared Freud thought that. And you were like, Freud. That's not where babies come from.
Which that is, I mean, okay, to Freud's credit, that is a thing that I kind of remember thinking as a kid. Yeah. And I have heard of other kids like thinking like, oh yeah, like babies just come out of a mom's butt.
Well,
Because,
yeah.
it's like, oh, my belly, food goes in my belly and then I poop. And I know that my poop is coming out from my belly.
And that is like, because it's like the child logic of, if they don't know all the names of the parts or how all the parts like work like with one another, then how are they to know? Especially because like so much is internal. Like a baby growing inside of a mother is 100% internal.
Right.
But also like, what happens with like food. And so it's like when it goes in your mouth and then it comes out the bottom, everything that happens in between is hidden from us by our bodies.
And kids aren't stupid for thinking that. They're making an educated guess.
Yeah, and I'm like, I wouldn't even say that it's like, oh, a child's logic. I think it'd be logic of, there've been a lot of scientists that have just looked at an animal and kind of made a guess as to like how you already know things typically function. And then you say, so I'm assuming that this is how this happens. And then it turns out that you're completely wrong, because who would have looked at a female anglerfish and what it turns out is a male anglerfish and thought that these two are going to hook up? You wouldn't. Yeah. And it's not because I have a child logic brain. It's because I don't have all of the information that I need to understand. It's not child brain or like an immature thought process. It's I don't have all the information, and children don't have all the information. I'm not saying that they have mature brains, because they don't, but also they lack the information that you would need to think otherwise. Freud goes on to say, if in later childhood the same question is the subject of solitary reflection or of a discussion between two children, the explanations probably are that the baby comes out of the navel, which opens, or that the body is slit and the child taken out, as happens to the wolf in the tale of Little Red Riding Hood. If babies are born through the anus, then a man can give birth just as well as a woman. A boy can therefore fancy that he too has children of his own without our needing to accuse him of feminine inclinations, because heaven forbid we accuse a boy of feminine inclinations. So later on, Freud is also talking about when it comes to, because he was looking at the Grimm's version of this tale. And so unlike the Charles Perrault version, he wasn't looking at the French version, which does not include the rocks at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so he was looking at those and trying to think of rocks could also be like, because the rocks aren't like living children, then they're a sign of impotence. Therefore, this woman is rendering the wolf impotent by like not children like inside of him. And so I'm like, there's stuff where I'm like, okay, I'm hearing what you're saying, but also in Greek mythology, Kronos is fed rocks instead of Zeus, or I'm trying to remember which one it is, but he's fed rocks like several different times instead of a baby, because he's been eating all of the children.
Right.
And so like this motif is not like totally new or unique or born out of, I mean, unless we are saying that like we all yearn to fill men up with rocks when they've wronged us and watch them sink to the bottom of a well. I'm not saying I don't. You got me there, Freud. You got me there. But sometimes it's like when they're trying to like, the symbology doesn't always like, when is a rock a sign of impotence, and like when is it not? Like when is a like group of people just using like a motif from another story because like it's a useful tale element, or like is it always done because we in some way find it psychologically pleasing and wish fulfillment? I don't know. I do not know.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's like I'm always torn about. Some psychological, like psychoanalytic stuff, it's like, okay, that makes sense, kind of. I see where you were coming with that. But I also feel like they then take it way too far. Like in this instance, it's like they just make too many leaps with their logic of like, okay, children, right? They think that babies come out of your butt. Okay, I'm with you there. And therefore, because children think that, in this story, rocks which aren't children, being put into something means that it's emasculating because we're putting something into something that never can have children, and the thing that we're putting into it is not children. Like,
Yeah.
it's like, wait, hold up. That's a huge leap there to be
Yeah.
like I just don't, I don't understand. It does help to remember that all these guys were just doing tons of cocaine at the time, I guess. But
Yeah.
anyway, sorry. You had said that we weren't going to be just like crapping on the psychoanalytic theories this whole episode, but here I am doing it because I'm just like so confused.
Oh, and so I'm like, here's a little quote for you from a different person. I was going to say one thing that I really appreciate in like this Casebook and in Alan Dundes, like his essay at the back, like wrapping up things, or he pulls in a lot of different information and analysis from like several different people. And so I will give you this quote. So this is from Eric Fromm in 1951, his book, The Forgotten Language. So he was looking at this story more on like a feminist psychoanalytic bent. And so he wrote, "The little cap of red velvet is a symbol of menstruation. The little girl of whose adventures we hear has become a mature woman and is now confronted with the problem of sex. The warning not to run off the path so as not to fall and break the bottle is clearly a warning against the danger of sex and of losing her virginity. The wolf's sexual appetite is aroused by the sight of the girl and he tries to seduce her." And what I think is really interesting about when people are trying to analyze the and they are cluing into the sexual overtones of the story, they were basically like led to think of it, this story in particular, in a sexual way by Charles Perrault, by the way that he had shaped the story and then made it like explicitly about sex.
Yeah.
Then when the Grimms are talking about this like breaking a bottle, well, the Grimms too were affected by Charles Perrault making the story explicitly about like, this is a metaphor for women. You are going to, young girls, pay attention. You're going to be attacked by creepy men.
Yeah. The thing to me is like, with the bottle, well, even with like the red cap, I'm like, I see what you're saying with the red cap, especially, but also why does it have to be that, you know, like, and with the breaking the bottle, I'm like, okay, like, I feel like that's where it again goes like too far. But what I do think is, I do think that there is like, in however this story came about, I do think that there is some sort of like potential like sexual element to it. But it's just kind of frustrating where it becomes like the only thing that this can possibly mean. Like, I feel like the story comes from the fact that when you are a child, male or female or whatever, and you go out into the woods by yourself, that is a dangerous situation that you will find yourself in. And so there are many dangerous things that could happen to you. And like, this wolf is representing those things, like physical danger of like being literally attacked by a wolf, physical danger of another human being who is like a wolf in grandma's clothing, a wolf in sheep's clothing, a wolf in, the disguise of a human being with a smiling face or whatever, a charming demeanor. Like, that's another possibility. It's like, it's just frustrating that it like just simplifies this. Like, this whole thing, every single thing means this one specific thing. It's like, that's part of it. Yeah, for sure. But I don't think it's all of it.
Especially like when you talk about kind of like going back and being like, okay, originally when this story was being told, okay, like I can see how this story is child that is girl. You're in danger when you're wandering through the woods alone by like animals. And here's where we come to kind of when we were talking about Vladimir Prop, we spoke about how he felt like one of the weaknesses, one of the problems inside of the ATU index was the fact that when those tales by Arn were being split into categories, the categories, then he felt, because you were taking them away from the structure, because we were talking about structure in that episode, structural analytics. he felt like you were separating stories away from each other and putting them into categories that then were actually making it harder to see similar tale types together. And one of the issues was that if you were grouping things together by animals, like ATU 123 is going to be in the animal section. But then tales like ATU 333 are in tales of magic, and you're not comparing those with each other, even though the story of the wolf and the kids is essentially the exact same tale type structurally as the Little Red Riding Hood. And when they got separated from each other and then analyzed that way, like away from each other, you had these Little Red Riding Hood stories that didn't have any, it was like, oh, there's no tales that are kind of like similar to them. But if you put them back with the animal stories, you can see that the stories started out as a much more popular story structure as them all being animals. This story is like all about animals. It's not about a little girl in the woods.
Yeah.
And it is more animal antics, like in Aesop's Fables, Reinhard the Fox, things like those type of like story structures. And so it's like, as it became a little girl and not animals anymore, well, it's like, well, now we are creating an entirely a different thing. And I mean, I do think psychologically speaking, by the people doing that, they were kind of identifying the usefulness of that tale type in communicating through story metaphor the dangers of being in the woods, the dangers of being attacked sexually. But do I think that the red cap symbolizes menstruation and signals to the wolf that this girl might be ready sexually for proclivity? No. I mean, you can see whatever you want, but I don't think that as the story was changing necessarily to be a little girl, it does not necessarily mean that everything that changed in the story was all symbolism subconsciously slipped in there by accident of the storyteller or on purpose of the storyteller, but subconsciously it'd be on accident of the storyteller to give more clues as to like the sexual maturity of this girl.
I totally agree. And it is interesting. I'm by myself thinking of sort of the difference between this as a folktale and then say like a novel or a movie or something that I'm reading that's like, that does have like an authorial voice to it that is intentionally putting symbolism in there for a reason. I don't know, like because I do think that some of this, like, psychoanalytic, symbolic language, whatever, like analyzing the symbolism of things, intentional or unintentional, is an interesting way of looking at things when I'm thinking of literary works or like movies or whatever, because I do think that there's more of, and maybe I'm wrong in this, but it's like in my mind, it's like there is more of an actual, like that is something that people are doing. Yeah. People are intentionally putting symbols into their work to communicate specific things beyond just what like the story itself is doing. And I don't know, there's a part of me that's like, I go back and forth in my mind of like, because of the nature of fairy tales, folk tales, and what I know about them, being sort of just like collective stories that were going around that don't have necessarily have like one authorial voice. One, I don't think it necessarily means that type of thing was not happening, that people weren't telling stories and like inserting some symbolism into them themselves. It's part of it's like, oh, like, is it just like reductive? Like, oh, because it's of the folk, they weren't being like as sophisticated and including some symbolism and stuff to try to communicate stuff. It's like, I'm not saying that, but it's like, and maybe am I kind of like leaning into that bit of a bias myself, bias established by people in the French salon who were thinking like, oh, like these stories of the folk are terrible because they're not as like sophisticated and whatever, or is it like kind of, true? But I guess part of the argument might be that because it's coming from, the people and there isn't an authorial voice, that then this is something that's like I think, I don't know about Freud so much, but like Jung talking about like the collective unconscious and all of that, like these symbols live inside of all of us that we're not even like aware of them. It's just like innate to human beings. And so of course these symbols are going to come out through the stories that we are all telling and that are relating, because these symbols relate to us on an unconscious level. So of course we think these things and feel these things. Like, I don't know if I actually believe that, but I don't know. So it's just like, I feel like I said a lot without really like making any kind of like point, except for just like talking through my thought process on it of like why I feel like it's different to look at fairy tales and folk tales through this like psychoanalytic lens. In the same way that it is fun with movies, I think there is something fun that you can do, and it's fun to think. But I guess part of it is like the tone of like, this is this thing that means this thing.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, it's interesting to think like, oh, what if this meant this? And what if this meant this? And what if this was this? That's an interesting way to think about it. But then just being like so sure, like, no, this is the way it is like,
especially because it's like we don't have the ability to kind of like go back to the people who are making the stories and be like, is that what you were getting at? And so like they don't have any authority to speak to be like, what? Like we're not giving the creators and the tellers of these tales like any ability to say, oh yeah, that was part of my inner dialogue, or like that is how I like thought or viewed things through
it's like, is this even something that they would have thought about? You know, it's like we think that it is because that's something that we think about and are concerned about for whatever reason nowadays. But it's like, is it actually something that they would have been concerned about?
So I wanted to keep reading these quotes from Eric Fromm, just because of some of the stuff that you said as like you were reading. I think you'll find them interesting. So this is Alan Dundes talking about like Eric Fromm and like what he said. So it says, Fromm argues that the fairy tale is more than simply a moralistic tale warning of the danger of sex. He claims that the, quote, male is portrayed as a ruthless and cunning animal, and the sexual act is described as a cannibalistic act in which the male devours the female. According to Fromm, this view is not held by women who like men and enjoy sex. It is an expression of a deep antagonism against men and sex. Fromm continues, but the hate and prejudice against men are even more clearly exhibited at the end of the story. We must remember that the woman's superiority consists in her ability to bear children. Yes, that is my superiority, is the ability to bear children. How then? Oh, yes, I'm like, he's got the impotent belly. How then is the wolf made ridiculous? By showing that he attempted to play the role of a pregnant woman, having living things in his belly. I don't think that's what the wolf was trying to do in the story. I think he was trying to eat because he likes food.
Yeah.
That's my brief aside.
It's like so weird and so frustrating to me too. It's like, okay, if this is supposed to be a thing about like how men are terrible, then why is it a wolf and not a man?
Mm-hmm.
You know, like in the Grimm's version too, it's like, why is it a man that comes and like helps them and rescues them if they hate men so much? Like, why make it a wolf when they're also human beings? Like, I mean, it makes more sense if it is, they're all animals. You know, that version of it's like, they're all animals and the man is being portrayed as a wolf because men are like this, but the women are being portrayed as goats because women are goat-like, or you know, whatever, like their general like personalities.
Because like one of the things that we talked about with when we like were looking at the uses of enchantment and like men as animals in stories is like to portray this like sexual taboo, or like that this female fear of sex. And so it's like the reason why he's not portrayed as a man is because he is the personification of the fear of sex.
Yeah.
But I think that I'm not arguing with you. Like,
Yeah, I know you're not. I know. But the thing is, like, that is an interesting idea. Like, I think that's an interesting idea. And I think there potentially is something to that idea, which is why it's so frustrating that then they go on to back that idea up with the stupidest arguments I've ever heard in my life of like, he was trying to be a pregnant woman by eating these people and having human beings inside of him. I was like, what are you talking about?
Especially when it's like, wait, if he's supposed to be a personification of the fear of like intercourse, but now he's mocking women by presenting as like pregnant.
Yeah.
But Eric Fromm concludes, this fairy tale in which the main figures are 3 generations of women.
Mm-hmm.
The huntsman at the end is the conventional father figure without real weight, even though he's the one that saves him. It's okay. Speaks of the male-female conflict. It is a story of triumph by man-hating women, ending with their victory. And I love that because I love that you just then had like pointed out, you're like, wait, if this is a story about women hating men, then like why is like the man not portrayed as a man? He's a wolf, and then the person who saves them is a man, and then he's like,
but carries no weight.
This man carries no weight, like except for the fact that he came and cut them open and like took them
Yeah,
out.
it's like, I'm glad to see that you actually considered the fact that the text does not agree with your interpretation of it. And then also proved my point that you're a complete idiot by then like just saying without any supporting evidence to be like, that carries no weight, even though he's the one that like rescues them in the end. How does that carry no weight? Like,
Yeah.
just because you say it doesn't mean it's true, dude. Like, that's the thing. That's the thing that I get. Like, back to what I was saying. It's so annoying because you're bringing up something. I think it is an interesting idea to think of the story in a way as like, women's fear of sexual violence. I think that's valid. I think it's interesting. I think it's part of the nuance. One small part, one small way to look at it. But it's just so frustrating when you make a really dumb argument to try to make that point. Anyway,
no. I'm like, this is good because
I did like how we brought up the 3 generations of women.
Yes, that's what I was like. I'm like, I do have a quote, but like, I was like, oh, this will be good, and I loved how viscerally you were reacting to the quotes. I really enjoyed that. And one thing that is really interesting, the thing that was really great about this essay, that Alan Dundes like wrote and was like pulling from like all these places, was he was talking about how the largest pitfall out of all of this like psychoanalytic stuff that was done is the fact that they are looking at usually one source or like one story. They're looking at the Grimm story is usually the one that they're like looking at and pulling from. And so when we're saying like, wait, but how can this be a story about man haters when like this detail happened or this there or this thing or this thing? And then not to mention like the fact that it's like they're not looking at the story either from like the larger context of like what created the story or like
like where these other elements came from to get into this story. Where it's like the wolf was eating goats because that's something that wolves do is they eat goats. Wolves are not trying to pretend to be goat moms by eating baby goats.
Yeah.
Like they're just trying to eat their dinner because that's what wolves eat.
Yeah.
Like so that's the point of like you're not if you look at where the story elements come from, it's like clear that what the argument you were making is wrong.
Yeah.
And which is what the point he's making is like, you're not considering, you're just looking at this one text, which as we know, like even though that was the version that was recorded and written down, doesn't make that the definitive version of the story either. So it's like, it's kind of like you're flawed to analyze, you're fine to analyze, I guess, the Grimm's brothers' psychology by what they chose to put in their version of the story, or Charles Perrault's psychology by what he chose to put in that version of the story, but then expanding that out to universal when you haven't even looked at the other versions of the same story or the tale types that like led into it or whatever, like it's just like, again, it's like flawed to then expand it out beyond the single author, the single tale, especially when you haven't even considered any of the other things.
And I've got some stuff that Alan Dundes pulled out that Jack Zipes has also said on like the conversation of like psychoanalyzing these tales. But before I get to that Jack Zipes stuff, I do want to point out that Jack Zipes has written, and this is a quote from him, "As is generally known, the major change made by the Grimms in their version of Little Redcap was the happy ending. Here, the Grimms borrowed a motif from the folk tale The Wolf and the Seven Kids. A hunter saves Little Redcap and her granny, and they proceed to fill the wolf's belly with stones. When the wolf tries to jump up and escape, the stones cause his death. If the Grimms have simply altered the Perrault version, then we would appear to have a case of a literary reworking of an oral tale. The Grimm version of The Little Red Riding Hood would thus be twice removed from genuine oral tradition." And so we have a problem there too when we're trying to psychoanalyze it, because it has ceased to be oral tale and it has become literary. People are purposefully changing things in it to moralize it or to do whatever their purpose is like with it. And so like you said, like we maybe can't say something about the folks subconscious as much as like the symbols that were like very purposefully put in, maybe some symbols subconsciously put in, but by the Grimm's brothers, or purposely put in by Perrault. And then moreover, if we assume that AT123 and AT333 are probably cognates, possibly subtypes of this same general tale type, with the critical difference depending upon whether the wolf comes to the house of the children or the children come to the house of the wolf, then the possibility that the Grimms borrowed the ending of AT123 to affix to the Perrault version of AT333 may not be such a heinous literary crime. One of the weaknesses of the Arne-Thompson tale type index system stems from Arne's decision to classify folktales on the basis of dramatis persona rather than plot structure. And so because Red Riding Hood is a human being, she's the main protagonist and she's human, she gets stuck in tales of magic. But because the goats are animals, they're in tales of animals.
Right.
And so it's split them up when it wouldn't. And that makes it harder to study the tale type when you don't know that you're looking at more related tales than you're aware of. So you're like missing half of your data points.
Yeah. And that is the thing we've talked about too, with like this thing to keep in mind of like the tale type index, the necessity to put something into a specific numbered type and separate types from one another, like artificially creates differences that seem bigger than they are, because you like had to choose, I put it in here or here. What reason did I do that? Well, it's like, it's just an arbitrary system that you're using that has utility and is helpful to look at things. But yeah, like you're saying, it's like it can create issues where it makes it harder to get a full picture of something, because it's based on, similar to how like what exact plot points are included is at the whim of the person collecting and writing down the version of an oral story, that's been told multiple times, that's not even told the exact same way by the same speaker every time, probably necessarily, like the choice that person made of what to include, the choice that someone made of which tale type to assign it, those things add up to, in some way like not misrepresent, but, like make us think about it in a specific way that isn't necessarily like inherent to the story or tale type itself.
And it's like, when things are arbitrarily placed into different categories, you're going to have problems because it's being categorized based on the decisions of a small number of people that are doing, okay, what's going to make it the easiest to find or categorize or whatever. And like eventually, you're looking at a platypus going, I don't know where to put you. And then you have to make a decision, and then it's not necessarily going to be end up down the road the most efficient placement or the most correct placement.
Yeah. And it's not even that it's arbitrary. It's just that like, I mean, sometimes it is, but it's also just that a choice had to be made, and it was like, you developed a system that causes you to put it in one category when your system can't take into every single variable that could possibly come up. There's a reason like this probably would fit better in this category, but the system I've created means it has to go into this one. Which, I mean, that specific element of it, I guess, is kind of arbitrary, but but like based on a system that has a reason for existing. Yeah. Just interesting. Zach Zipes, smart guy, way smarter than me. He makes a lot of sense.
And here's some more stuff by Jack Zipes when he.
Yeah.
So these quotes are coming from his essay, The Trials and Tribulations of Little Red Riding Hood. Little Red Riding Hood is a male creation and projection. Not women, but men, Perrault and the Brothers Grimm gave birth to our common image of Little Red Riding Hood. So, quoting from, I'm like, it's confused because I'm like, Alan Dundes in this essay, quoting Jack Zipes. Zipes says further, viewed in this light, Little Red Riding Hood reflects men's fear of women's sexuality and of their own as well. The curbing and regulation of sexual drives is fully portrayed in this bourgeoisie literary fairy tale on the basis of deprived male needs. Red Riding Hood is to blame for her own rape. The wolf is not really a male, but symbolizes natural urges and social unconformity. The real hero of the tale, the hunter-gamekeeper, is male governance. That's not, I just want to point out, that's not Jack Zipes saying that that's something that he agrees with. But he's like, if we're thinking about it in the way that like this story was written by men and how they viewed who's to blame for a rape happening. Because Charles Perrault, when he's saying like, oh, this story is about a little girl who is devoured by a man, by like a wolf. And Charles Perrault was very blatantly saying, like, girls, this is a story about men attacking women, and you're to blame.
He said that's what it is.
And Charles Perrault was saying, and women, you're kind of to blame for that. You shouldn't be such tempting morsels trouncing around in the woods. And so it is when Eric Fromm is saying, like, this is a story about women hating men. And Zipes is like, then why did men write it? Like,
yeah, it's a story about men thinking that women hate men. Like, if that's a valid argument that you're making to begin with, it's not a story about how women hate men. It's a story about how men think that women hate men.
And so Alan Dundes goes on to say, secondly, Zipes contends that Fromm, Bettelheim, and others have exacerbated the problem because they, as males, have interpreted the Perrault and Grimm versions to reaffirm conventional male attitudes toward women. The girl is guilty because of her natural inclinations and disobedience. Fromm, it may be recalled, claimed the tale displayed hate and prejudice against men, and that it constituted a story of triumph by man-hating women, while Bettelheim felt that Little Red Cap's danger is her budding sexuality, for which she is not yet emotionally mature enough. In other words, both the male-altered tale and the male interpretation of this story constitute a kind of male conspiracy to stereotype and dominate women. Love it. And what I love about that is Zipes kind of pointing out that all of the psychoanalytic process, especially in like the early years that was going on too, was kind of like feeding into its own self, into like convincing their own selves about the thing that they themselves feared, where it's like, oh, this is a story about women hating men. Oh no, the women are going to get out and like come and get it. And it's like not even thinking for like a second that it's like these stories were written down by men. And also as like non-folklorists too, not being aware that they shouldn't be looking at one example of a tale and not looking at the provenance of that tale, of looking at like the history of that tale. Of Charles Perrault was a person who had an agenda when he was writing down those stories, and a lot of his agenda slipped into this tale. The Grimm's brothers too had an agenda with what they were doing, and a lot of that agenda slipped into the tale. And so then when you're analyzing it, like the psychoanalytics of it, but you're not thinking about the fact that the people who wrote it down also were crafting it their own way, sometimes it turns into this like big, weird jumble. But also at the same time, it does speak to the psychology of the tellers of the tale and also the analyzers of the tale and like what's going on with them. And so like the last time when we talked about the like psychoanalytic approach, there are interesting things to be gained by looking at a story about the psychology of it, of like, why does it stick with us? Why does it bear repeating? Those kind of things, they do play into our psychology of why these stories end up mattering to us. And so it is worthwhile to look at the psychology of the tellers of the tales and human psychology in general, and why we do the things that we do, why we fear the things that we fear, what things become taboo, and what things are speakable and mockable. But one of the things that Alan Dundes also talks about, which we are not going to get to in this episode, is what about the other tales that people were not looking at to analyze? The ones that came before Charles Perrault, and the ones also that ended up coming from China and Korea and Japan. Dun, dun, dun.
Thank you for listening to The Fairy Tellers. If you enjoy what we're doing, please leave us a review or share us with your friends. For access to exclusive bonus content, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thefairytellers. Special thanks to Andy Forey for our music, and to Clarice Inch for our artwork. And of course, a big thank you to all our patrons. Without all of you, this show wouldn't be possible.
Good stories pay little attention to cultural or linguistic frontiers. The student of story collections find themselves adrift on an ocean of stories, an ocean which is boundless, deep, and ceaseless in motion. Robert Irwin. So.
Oh, shoot.
Oh, God.
I just spilled water.